Hello, and welcome back to Political Psychology with Abby. Today I want to talk about the relationship between fear and guns, both fear that motivates pro gun attitudes and actions, and how fear may influence anti gun attitudes and actions. Thanks to Sfera for submitting the question that became this video. Sorry it took so long. If you've got a question for next time, put it in the comments. Also, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. So, my plan here isn't to persuade you that guns won't work for self defense. This is not because the data indicates that owning a gun or carrying one will make you safer. We have pretty clear data that gun ownership won't protect you overall. Here's a summary of one article on the topic. There are many articles on this topic, but the efficacy of guns is not the main subject of this video. This article is fairly representative of the scientific consensus on the topic, and if it doesn't convince you, I doubt quoting from many additional similar articles would. Thing is, if you're very pro-gun, I'm probably not going to do any better at changing your mind than anyone else is. And if you're anti-gun, or like me, in that you're not opposed to gun ownership, you just want it more strictly regulated, there are loads of videos and articles arguing that side better than I can. I'm not about arguing, I'm not about debating, I'm not about destroying my opposition. What I want to do here is explain the psychology of how fear relates to both sides of the gun control debate. In order to do that, I need to operate on the assumption that from a statistical perspective, gun ownership and carrying a gun does not increase your personal safety. This is what the vast majority of the data indicates. This is not a debate channel. I'm not going to debate the data with you. However, if you're itching to debate me on this, I might be able to offer you some insights into your motivations. Don't worry, I'll get all sciencey about my motivations too. It's only fair. First, I want to tell you a little story about why I said that first bit. So, I have an Instagram account associated with the channel. It's @politicalpsych with Abby. I mostly post summaries and commentaries on articles I'm reading for my political psychology master's degree. You should definitely go follow me. Yes, this is a shameless plug. Anyway, I posted an article about motivated reasoning and gun ownership and my opinions on it. One conclusion of the article is that gun owners engage in motivated reasoning in order to attempt to demonstrate the utility of their chosen weapon. Motivated reasoning is using emotionally biased reasoning to produce justifications or make decisions that are most desired, rather than those that accurately reflect the evidence, while still reducing cognitive dissonance. Basically, the article is about how gun owners are more likely to believe that the world is a dangerous place and to be motivated to believe that choosing to own a gun makes them safer. I stated perhaps too vaguely that guns are not effective in self-defense. I meant overall that owning one does not make you safer, not that they can ever be used in self-defense. Also, even in self-defense situations, guns are not, statistically speaking, more effective than other means of self-defense. Anyway, so someone got a bit confrontational in the Instagram comments. I should mention this is not a call out. I'm not going to show you his posts. Don't go bother him. He asked me if I'd ever been in a violent confrontation where I had to defend myself. He was clearly trying to do this in order to invalidate my argument, which, since I was talking about a sample size that did not include me, was arguably totally irrelevant. And I was frustrated because he was clearly trying to pick a fight. I really don't like confrontation. Making a political YouTube channel may have been a mistake. Anyway, in my opinion, it was way too personal a question to ask about commentary on a scientific article made by a total stranger. I replied and clarified as politely as I could, but I didn't answer the personal question. If I was good at and or enjoyed internet arguments, I would have asked him if he was ever in a situation that would have been more dangerous if someone involved was armed. Eventually, I stopped replying. I'm always happy to clarify and answer questions about the science, but debates and Instagram comments are not my idea of productive or enjoyable. Still, he got under my skin a bit, and so I showed the conversation to a friend who also studies political psychology. She quite cleverly pointed out that his response was the exact sort of motivated cognition that the article had been talking about. I guess the point of that little story is to illustrate the importance of being aware of the science behind your own biases, and also to illustrate how understanding our own emotional responses to these issues could help us talk about them in a better way. So, what I'm trying to do here is improve the conversation using science rather than use it to win the argument. So, let's start with how fear relates to why people buy and carry guns. The most obvious connection here would be to say that people buy guns because they fear being the victims of crime. There is some evidence to support this connection. However, not every study finds fear of crime to be connected to gun ownership. One study found that fear predicted gun ownership in men, but not women. This is especially relevant as many studies on gun ownership focus mostly or exclusively on male gun owners. This makes some sense given that most gun owners are male, but one can't assume that patterns around men and guns also apply to women. In this study, the reason that fear of crime does not seem to correlate to gun ownership in women might have to do with the way that fear of crime was assessed. A later study on why non gun owners might want to purchase guns found that women were more fearful of crime and victimization than men, and were more likely to consider owning a gun in the future, primarily in order to protect themselves. This raises the question, if women are more afraid of crime and victimization than men, why do more men than women own guns? Part of the reason might be that men are more likely to see gun ownership as empowering. Part of the reason might also be that specific fear of crime and victimization does not account for every type of fear that might motivate someone to own a gun. That's what Strobe et al. Propose. They found that in addition to perceiving a higher risk that they will be the victims of crime, men who own guns for self-defense are also more likely to perceive the world as a dangerous, unpredictable, and threatening place. Fear, more generally, does seem to be a motivator for people to buy guns for self-defense, even if what they're afraid of is a bit vague. Just a note here, as with most things in psychology, I'm talking about general trends. I'm not saying that if you have a gun, you have it because you're scared, although it is possible to be motivated by fear and not consciously know about it or admit it. There is evidence that higher levels of fear in people who don't own guns might motivate them to buy guns. Interestingly, the same study that found that gun owners low in fear are not more likely to give up their guns. So the pattern around fear and gun ownership isn't as simple as scared person buys gun, scared person keeps gun. Some research has also delved into the uptick in gun purchases that tends to happen after mass shootings. One possible explanation for this would be that people who see coverage of mass shootings in the media might feel more threatened and then decide to go buy a gun for self-defense. However, further research indicates that people who respond this way to mass shootings are probably a tiny atypical minority. An even stranger, but probably more significant connection between gun purchasing and fear comes in the form of fear of gun control. Basically, when people fear that new gun control measures are likely to be put in place, they go get more guns. This was perhaps most clearly seen in 2008 when demand for guns increased in response to the fear of Obama-era gun control policy. The sort of insane thing is that since Obama did not actually get that much done in terms of gun control, which you definitely can't blame entirely on him, in certain states the amount of guns in circulation went up because people were afraid of gun control. While this study on the increase in gun purchasing did not find conclusive evidence that racism against America's first black president motivated gun purchasing, other studies have found that racism does correlate somewhat with gun ownership among white people. This is just a correlation. If you've got a gun, that doesn't mean you're a racist, and if you don't have a gun, that doesn't mean you aren't a racist. Still, there is a connection through fear here. If someone fears black or other minority people doing harm to them, this would probably motivate them to look for a method of protection. There is also, unfortunately, no escaping the connection between certain pro-gun ideologies and certain racist ideologies. So, there is a general idea of how fear motivates gun ownership. People do own guns for a ton of other reasons, though, from wanting to feel masculine and empowered to hunting or just finding them fun. And you know what? Lefty, mostly pescatarian, soft creature of civilization that I am, I did shoot a gun into a snowbank once, and you know what? It was fun. So then why am I talking about fear? Well, one reason is that talking about the psychology of everything relating to guns and gun control would make this video boring and endless. The other reason is that fear can be a powerful motivator, including in politics, so that makes it very relevant to the issue of gun control. Speaking of, let's talk about how fear leads people to oppose gun control. First off, it does make sense that if people own a thing and think that thing is keeping them safe, they probably aren't going to want it taken away. And in fact, there is evidence that owning a gun motivates people to defend gun rights and the use of guns in a wide variety of situations. The interesting thing is that that isn't what most gun control legislation is for. Most gun control legislation only seeks to regulate certain types of guns and equipment, to expand background checks, or to stop people with a history of violence or abuse from getting guns. These proposals are actually something most Americans, including many gun owners, agree on. Here's some data on what percentage of Americans support different gun control policies. Part of the issue may be that gun owners are persuaded to see any gun control as someone coming for their guns. This could absolutely be a fear-based response. And pro-gun political organizations are definitely guilty of stoking fear on a variety of topics, some of which are at most tangentially related to guns. As an example, let's talk about a piece from the now defunct NRA TV. I've bolded every reference to something the viewers are supposed to fear. Unfortunately, I can't replicate Lash's very intense tone or the spooky music, but here goes. They use their media to assassinate real news. They use their schools to teach children that their president is another Hitler. They use their movie stars and singers and award shows to repeat their narrative over and over again. And then they use their ex-president to endorse the resistance. All to make them march, make them protest, make them scream racism, sexism, and xenophobia, and homophobia, and smash windows, burn cars, shut down interstates and airports, bully and terrorize the law-abiding, until the only option left is for police to do their jobs and stop the madness. And when that happens, they'll use that as an excuse for their outrage. The only way we stop this, the only way we save our country and our freedom, is to fight this violence of lies with the clenched fists of truth. I'm the National Rifle Association of America, and I'm freedom's safest place. Ooh, that left a nasty taste in my mouth. Moving on. So now I've bolded every direct reference to guns. As you can see, there are many fewer references. This definitely connects to the concept of belief in a dangerous world that I was talking about before. Also, this guy on NRA TV just smashes a TV with a sledgehammer while wearing a Socialist Tears t-shirt. Is it me, or is that weirdly off message that uses a sledgehammer and not a gun? At least a few of the clips playing on the TV are gun-related, but many of them aren't. Evidence that opposition to gun control is linked to specific fear of being a victim of a crime is somewhat mixed. So part of the fear is likely to be linked instead to a more general fear of a dangerous world or to other factors. Okay, so now let's move on to how fear may relate to support for gun control. So if you spend a lot of time in pro-gun circles, you might recognize the word hoplophobia. If you're like me, before I made this video, you might have no idea what it means. If you're my spell check, you also have no idea what it means and think I'm talking about homophobia, which I'm not. Anyway, hoplophobia is a word coined by Jeff Cooper in 1966. It means an irrational, morbid fear of guns. I do want to mention off the bat that this is not a term I've seen used as a scientific term in peer-reviewed writing on this topic. However, that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it, just that we need to treat it with caution and has not stood up to the same scrutiny as other concepts in this video. So let's talk about Jeff Cooper, the person who coined the term. I'm going off Wikipedia for some of this information, which is something I normally would not do, but the only other choice is often explicitly pro-gun sources. While talking about how fear affects people who are pro-gun and anti-gun control, I used almost entirely scientific articles and not explicitly anti-gun sources, so I think it would be unfair to use a pro-gun source here. Back on topic, Jeff Cooper was a U.S. Marine and firearms instructor and was on the board for the National Rifle Association, so he knew his guns. However, he did not necessarily know his psychology. He apparently coined the word hoplophobia in response to a perceived need for a word to describe a mental aberration consisting of an unreasoning terror of gadgetry, specifically weapons. It is also very worth noting that he was very pro-gun and quite fiercely conservative. Many of his opinions would, I hope, be objectionable to everyone, including conservatives. However, I suspect in some cases that hope is in vain. So here are some of his views. He wrote in Guns and Ammo magazine in 1991 that no more than 5 to 10 people in 100 who die by gunfire in Los Angeles are any loss to society. These people fight small wars amongst themselves. It would seem a valid social service to keep them well supplied with ammunition. I wonder if he thought any of those people who were, in his view, no loss to society were unreasonably terrified of weapons. He also had some views less related to guns that might still make you doubt his logical faculties and intentions. For example, he supported the governments of apartheid-era South Africa and Rhodesia. You could honestly see a pattern of not treating all human life as valuable here. Let's move on to how people talk about hoplophobia today. One post on a pro-gun website says that people with hoplophobia should seek treatment. Now, I think that people who freak out when they say see a gun on TV might want to talk to a professional about that. However, the website is clearly talking about all supporters of gun control as hoplophobes. This would mean that they are suggesting, by most estimates, that more than half of Americans are in desperate need of treatment because they think that deadly weapons should be regulated. Now, I'm a social psychologist, not a clinical psychologist, but I feel confident telling you that if you went in for treatment for this supposed phobia with most therapists, they would find it extremely bizarre. To learn more about phobias, let's consult the most recent version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM, which is a tool used in diagnosing mental illnesses. The full description of what makes a phobia is long and complex. So for now, let's talk about why not everyone afraid of guns, or everyone who supports gun control, can be said to have a gun-related phobia. So one trait of a phobia is that the fear or anxiety is out of proportion to the actual danger posed by the specific object or situation and to the sociocultural context. So, in some situations, this could be true about guns, like if someone is freaked out by a gun in a museum. However, in many situations, fearing a gun is totally reasonable. Here's another criteria for phobia that hoplophobia fails to meet. The fear, anxiety, or avoidance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. You can definitely have a totally functional existence while being afraid of guns. Also, most people's fear response to guns probably does not meet the threshold for clinical significance. It probably goes without saying that the DSM does not list hoplophobia, although there are some phobias that are not listed in the DSM, it just provides examples. It is worth saying, though, that none of the examples are man-made things even partially designed for harming or killing. Also, just generally, if something is really common, it isn't usually classed as any sort of mental illness. Basically, the only thing in favor of hoplophobia being a phobia is that guns are things and some people are scared of them. Some people might then ask, does it make sense to class it as something like homophobia, which is a useful term and a real thing, even if it may not reach the medical definition of phobia? This doesn't make sense because gay people do not pose legitimate harm, so anxiety experienced in response to them would be out of proportion. And also, since being afraid of gay people might seriously impair someone's life. It is worth mentioning that a lot of what we describe as homophobia may not actually be fear-based, but that is a massive topic, better left for another day. Also, just personally, I think it'd be bad to equate an attitude towards deadly weapons to an attitude towards a group of humans, so I would encourage people not to do that. Certain pro-gun groups might tell you that there is scientific evidence for hoplophobia. There is some work on this topic by someone called Sarah Thompson, MD, and described as a psychiatrist. There are multiple people by this name, some of whom are psychiatrists and some of whom are medical doctors, so I can't and won't claim that Sarah Thompson isn't an MD or a psychiatrist. What I can tell you is that her work on hoplophobia is not peer-reviewed. This means it has not gone through the process by which scientists make sure other scientists aren't just making shit up. It is okay for people to theorize and write about science in a less formal and evidence-based way, but this sort of informal theorizing should just be a jumping off point for rigorous evidence-based inquiry, not a substitute for it. Thompson's work is absolutely being positioned by dishonest pro-gun groups as if it is accepted scientific fact, or at least a scientifically backed position held by many experts. It is nowhere close to being either. For a full insight on why hoplophobia is harmful nonsense, I'd suggest reading this Media Matters article. So I don't want to go point by point examining Thompson's article Raging Against Self-Defense, because it's not worth that much of your time or mine. Instead, I'm just going to dissect a particularly egregious paragraph which forms a core of her argument. She starts off talking about her own experience, which typically isn't done in scientific articles. It occasionally is done in less formal introductions as a way to hook the reader, but here she is positioning it as key to her argument, which is not how science works. She provides no evidence for what is a sweeping and significant claim that anti-gun people harbor more rage than others, or they're less able to cope with it appropriately. She does cite sources at the end of the article. However, in psychology articles, this claim would warrant an in-text citation, meaning that the author needs to cite a source for the specific claim. So in this passage, she's continuing to make sweeping claims without evidence. Also, it's all built on her initial unproven claim. Oof. Okay, so this claim here is racist, sexist, and anti-Semitic. And it is hardly the only racist, sexist, or anti-Semitic claim in her work. Also, she does not cite any research about the relative hysteria of various anti-gun groups. I do not believe such research exists. So she is just asking her readers to go off assumptions, which yet again is almost laughably bad science. She doesn't even cite data about the demographic makeup of anti-gun groups, which she could probably find. I should point out that the bigoted thing isn't pointing out demographic variation. It is calling large groups of people, especially oppressed people, hysterical with no evidence. Automatically connecting certain demographics to hysteria is just so messed up. Also, fun fact, hysteria is derived from the Greek term for uterus, because for much of history, people thought that uteruses or wombs made women go nuts. So yeah, using accusations of hysteria to silence marginalized groups and call them crazy is not remotely new. Next, Thompson claims that virtually all of the organizations that claim to speak for these oppressed people are stridently anti-gun. Yet, no evidence is cited for this. Also, I'd point Thompson in the direction of the Black Panthers for an obvious and prominent exception that she does not seek to explain. So, the concept of professional victims, which Thompson refers to here, is basically a nonsense conspiracy theory and is used to silence activism on a ton of important issues. And there's a lot of psychological and other literature on the identity experiences of women, Black people, and Jews, none of which she seems to be even slightly interested in learning about. Much of the psychological literature on identity does indicate that realizing you've been oppressed can be a motivator for activism, but the idea that these activists identify only as victims is counterintuitive, as a sense of agency is a key factor in motivating activism. At this point, if you're pro-gun, I'm going to offer you an extra thank you for sticking around, and I'm going to point out that my indictment of these people's ideas is not an indictment of you. I am going to point out that if you're pro-gun and you oppose racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and incredibly bad science, you should distance yourself from people like this. Okay, now that that's all out of the way, what does psychology actually have to say about fear and support for gun control? So the data here is mixed again. Heath et al. Found that fear of crime does actually increase support for gun control. However, this is when a number of other factors that might influence support for gun control, such as gender, personal experience, and risk of crime, are accounted for. In addition, those who were close to mass shootings do tend to become more supportive of gun control. Still, there is some very real evidence that other factors may impact support for gun control. Research in this area is more lacking than research on gun owners and people opposed to gun control. Part of the reason for this may be that most research in this area contrasts gun owners and non gun owners, not people who oppose and support gun control. This could also be an issue in that many gun owners do support some level of gun control. Cahan and Barham make a compelling point with the statement, in the case of the gun control debate, the issue is not whether to accept a particular risk, but rather which of two risks, that of firearm casualties in a world with insufficient gun control, or that of personal defenselessness in a world with excessive control, should be deemed more alarming. Which is deemed more alarming varies based on a variety of cultural and personal factors. So I would say that instead of asking who is more afraid or diagnosing the opposition with non-existent phobias, we should instead treat fear with understanding, but also with facts. Not all fears are equally valid. The validity of these fears should be decided not via political rhetoric, but by data. Someone being scared does not make them wrong, nor does it make them right. It also does not make them evil. I would also like to say that the gun control debate in America is much more nuanced than usually presented, with many people supporting some gun control legislation and not other legislation. What I would urge people to do is examine data that has been collected in a scientific and nonpartisan manner before deciding their views on specific aspects of gun control. Thanks so much for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Do you have a question about political psychology that I could answer next time? Then comment it below.